Hello world, my name is Andy Silvers and today I'm going to talk about 2D versus 3D animation. Alright, so this channel is generally dedicated to the writing and publishing process for novels. However, technically I am an author, filmmaker, and graphic designer, so occasionally I may make a video on a topic under that list. So today I felt passionate about 2D animation and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about 2D animation at the box office and in theaters, talk about the history just a little bit, and talk about the future of 2D animation. Because many people say that it's basically going away and that it's never coming back, and some people don't understand it. They're like, 2D animation is amazing, where's it going? So I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to address some points that I feel that sometimes other people neglect. So to begin with, we're going to talk about what you might call the demise of 2D animation. So 2D animation basically began to phase out around the time Toy Story came out in 1995. So Toy Story came out from Pixar in 1995 and made right around $394 million at the box office, which of course, adjusted for inflation, is even more. So it was a huge hit back in 1995, and it sort of sparked the revolution for 3D animation. 3D animation was new, it was cool, and of course it was profitable, which is the biggest thing that studios are looking for. And then this was followed up by other big hits like Shrek in 2001, which made over $487 million, and Incredibles, which made over $631 million in 2004. So the year before that, in 2003, 2D animated film Brother Bear only made around $250 million, which sounds pretty good, except that the budget was around $128 million, which is very similar to actually the budget of a lot of 3D animated films. So you can see that on average, the box office for 3D animated films was going up, and on average, the box office for 2D animated films was going down. I mean, Lion King came out, I believe, in 94, 95, I'd have to check. But that film made over $900 million at the box office, and then the re-release later bumped it up to over $1 billion at the box office. But once you hit the early 2000s, those numbers are starting to go down. And of course, one of the obvious motivators for 2D animation going away and 3D becoming the norm was the box office. The box office greatly increased in the early 2000s and went even higher in the mid-2000s and 2010s, with films like Frozen, Despicable Me 3, and Zootopia all making over $1 billion at the box office. So, despite the big budgets of these movies often exceeding $100 million, 3D animated films were still making great profit, so they were worthwhile to the studios. However, the demise of 2D animation isn't just linked to box office. Another issue with 2D animation is that it couldn't do everything that 3D animation could, visually speaking. So audiences were blown away by the realism of films like The Good Dinosaur and the incredible action scenes in movies like Incredibles 2, all of which were just simply not possible in 2D animation. That's not to say that 2D animation can't look fairly real. Films like 2003's The Garden of Words is an exception where the film looks incredibly realistic and is 2D animation. However, there comes this sort of line where 2D animation starts to be so complex and so realistic that it might as well just be 3D animation. You start to spend so much money and so much time making 2D animation look real that you might as well just use 3D animation. It's going to probably cost you around the same amount, and it'll look arguably even better. And even 2D animated films began to incorporate 3D elements. Like, for example, Beauty and the Beast has the ballroom scene, and the movie, I believe, Spirit Stallion of the Camarilla, whatever it's called, has 3D sort of camera moves where the camera is moving around a 3D environment, and some 2D animated elements are put on top of it. So even in 2D animation, 3D is sort of creeping its way in, because 3D animation, generally speaking, was cheaper than 2D animation, particularly if the 2D animation was hand-drawn. And so some elements could be thrown in as 3D animated elements and actually save money. And a lot of you are going to say, of course, what about anime? Anime is an amazing genre. It's an amazing area of 2D animation. However, it's not particularly popular in the US with regard to box office. Sure, there are plenty of people in the US that watch it, but those people don't necessarily buy very many tickets. So, for example, Spirited Away came out in the year 2001 and grossed over $355 million at the box office, which sounds like a lot, and it is, but only around 4% of that came from the US. More recently, the film Your Name, which was released in 2016, made over $350 million as well at the box office, but even less of that, 1.4%, came from the US box office. So if you live in the US, or any non-Asian country for that matter, and you're wondering why more 2D animated films or even anime don't come out, this is the reason why. Investors simply aren't going to create domestic anime films or US-made anime films and release them in the US with big marketing campaigns and ad pushes and so on and so forth if it's not particularly profitable. The domestic numbers simply have to improve, or 2D animation and anime specifically just isn't going to catch on in the United States. But the problem isn't just limited to anime. Non-anime 2D animation has typically done pretty poorly in the United States, generally, like I said, since generally the early 2000s. So the most successful 2D animated film since 2000 is basically the movie, The Simpsons movie, which made an astounding $536 million at the box office. However, this is an extremely rare outlier. Typically, that is not the case. And even movies that are part of a franchise aren't necessarily guaranteed to be successful. So more recently, the film My Little Pony, which I believe came out in 2016, and the movie Teen Titans Go, which I believe came out in 2018, both of those films made less than $70 million worldwide. So that is a huge difference. I mean, you have $536 million for Simpsons. You have $350 million for Your Name, for instance. Less than $70 million worldwide is not what an investor wants to see. And so that's obviously a big problem. And what recent 2D animated films, including those two films, have done has lowered the budget significantly. Lower the budget to basically $10 million or less. If you can keep the 2D animated film budget $10 million or less, then you can release it at the box office in theaters and have a pretty good chance of it making money back. Even Disney themselves had difficulty with 2D animated films. I believe in 2009 they released Princess and the Frog, and while it was profitable, it was barely so. It just did not bring in the amount of box office that a typical Disney animated film brings in. Another channel, Screen Rant, posted a video where they argued that the problem was poor quality, that the films that I mentioned were not necessarily very good. And I can understand this argument to a large extent. So, obviously, Teen Titans Go received poor reviews. My Little Pony received relatively positive reviews, but it was what you call a one-quadrant film. It didn't target boys, generally speaking, and it didn't target adults, generally speaking. So it wasn't a movie that even could necessarily appeal to the number of people required to make a film, say, $500 million at the box office. However, I believe that there's another component to this discussion, and that is that realism is the new standard. So I believe that Disney made classics in 2D because they literally couldn't do them in live action. Movies like Aladdin and Lion King and Beauty and the Beast are all being remade in live action today. And while this certainly is for the purposes of profit, obviously, I think there's truth to the idea that those movies would have been made, I think, using 3D animation back when they first came out, had that been an option. But literally, 3D animated technology wasn't at the level it needed to be, and certainly live-action VFX were not at the place it needed to be to make Lion King in 1995. It just wasn't going to happen. And so movie studios had to use 2D animation to even tell these stories. But now, they don't have to. So 3D, in some sense, has become the go-between between 2D and live action. 2D was used because it had to be, but now it doesn't have to be used anymore. And ironically, studios are now simply trying to make 3D animation look more and more realistic. I mean, you have Coco, for instance, from Pixar that looks incredibly believable. And more recently, another Pixar film, Soul, which looks even more believable, has lens flares, it has shallow depth of field, it has blooming and overexposure, and it just looks incredibly realistic. And so I think that the realism is sort of the new standard in Hollywood is contributing to the decline of 2D animation. And there's been a number of films the past several years that are animated, 2D animated, that have been nominated for Best Animated Feature, which means they're quite good. And yet their box office is incredibly low. And it just doesn't really make a lot of sense until you realize that one of the main reasons for this is marketing. The studio simply refuses to put in the money to marketing these films. They just will not do it. They don't make Happy Meal toys. They don't make posters. They don't have clever campaigns. Like Avengers Endgame had the clever campaign, "Don't spoil the Endgame." It was a hashtag, and that got social media chattering. That got people talking about the film and talking about having to see it opening weekend too, so nothing was spoiled for them. That's the kind of clever marketing that 2D animated films need to incorporate as well, because they're still films, just like any other movie. But generally speaking, the studios just refuse to put in the money. And one of the reasons for this is because a lot of the movies I mentioned are Oscar bait movies, which means that the studio feels like if they get that nomination or win, they've done what they needed to do. And maybe that's true. Maybe some of these small 2D films aren't intended, quote unquote, to make big box office. But if you want to see 2D animation come back, it has to make box office, so it's just not going to come back in theaters. And I would love to know what your thoughts are on the topic, so please leave a comment below and tell me what you think. And also, please like this video, subscribe, share this video with your friends. And also, as an author, I have to plug my book, Red Sprites and Blue Jets. It's a coming-of-age children's novel. It is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble with a 4.8 out of 5 stars, so go check it out. Thank you for watching.